Greetings, greenhouse people, and welcome to another installment of Tech on Demand, where our goal is always to bring you tips, tricks, and information to produce your best crops ever. I'm your host, Bill Calkins, and I'm thrilled to be joined by Dr. Will Healy, who's the Senior Technical Manager for Ball Horticultural Company. We're here to talk about at-risk crops and the inherent challenges with specific crops grown in thousands of North American greenhouses. These are the usual suspects, plants that come under pressure from specific pests or diseases. And Dr. Healy is going to help give you information to produce these crops by managing pressures using strong preventative strategies and putting programs in place to minimize the risk. And that's beyond the normal pests and diseases, right, Will?
You're right. And that's the one crop that we're going to talk about today is really kind of an interesting one because of that. It's most people don't know about it because they're just starting to get back into growing cannas. So it's really kind of an exciting topic to talk about to get people aware of just a risk that they need to be looking out for and understanding how to manage it.
And it's cool because I really like cannas. They do add a lot of flair to mixed containers and even in the landscape now with some of the new varieties. And I think we all kind of know the basics of at-risk crops, but there's a lot more that Will has to share. So, Will, when you're working with growers, talking about at-risk crops with some of the production teams and how to manage them, what are the steps you go through and how should folks approach at-risk crops when they're planning? I guess in the hopes of minimizing challenges throughout production. I think we're going to look a little bit at the classic triangle, right?
Yeah, let's just talk about this. The classic disease triangle of the plant, the pathogen, and the environment, or their cultural conditions. When you have all three of them together, a little bit of a stir of the pot, and suddenly you've got problems. So when we talk about crops that are at risk, we really need to sit down and ask the question, what are the risk factors that we need to be managing as growers to be successful? Cannas, of course, fell out of favor many years ago because people used what are technically called rhizomes. A lot of people just call them bulbs. It was that big bulb thing. And what was happening is you get a lot of disease problems, streak, and they just didn't perform well and they fell out of favor. Although consumers love them, they provide a spectacular focal point in the garden. So let's talk a little bit about what's changed and what are some of the options. The first one that we need to remember is that with the cannas, you really need to use seed or tissue culture. Primarily seed because it's much easier and more cost effective than tissue culture, but you need to make sure that you're using tested seed that has been tested to be free of various viruses. This is a virus problem, unlike any of the other crops that we've been dealing with, Bill. In the past, we've talked about a number of crops where there's bacterial problems or there's fungal problems, patience downy mildew being one that comes to mind. But there's this one is a pure virus problem. Gets other diseases, but viruses are in. So one of the things we need is make sure we start out clean, because if you start out clean, as you'll see, things will go well. Make sure that you've got a clean production facility as always, so that you don't have any pet plants hanging around that could be vector, basically repositories for these viruses, which then basically insects and diseases can carry from the infected plants to your canna crop. Make sure that you're using optimum cultural protocols, because with a lot of viruses, any kind of stress condition causes that expression of the virus. So we really want to be able to focus on that. So let's keep in mind the disease triangle as we move through our next crop that we're going to talk about, which is cannas. So, by all means, at-risk crops, canna, today's topic.
Excellent, excellent. So why don't you talk a little bit about the risk factors specific to this tropical plant? And I see you've got some lovely, ugly foliage on the screen. Why don't you take us through that a little bit and we can understand the risk factors a little bit better?
Of course, Bill, the beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Now, some people would say these are lovely variegated plants, but a pathologist or probably your local plant inspector would beg to differ with you if you started seeing a lot of expression of this. Probably, if you look at picture D, which is the second one down, on the left-hand side where you've got a little red, this is one of the symptoms that you can see where all of a sudden the red foliage takes on this variegated green and red, which is kind of undesirable. But these are all different viruses that basically can give you streaking, unlike the one in the top left-hand corner, which is all green, which is the normal plant. There's 3 virus groups we need to worry about. This is going to be a little pointy head conversation, but I think it's important to understand what are the issues. The biggest concern is Canna yellow mosaic virus. It is a DNA virus, which is very different than any of the other viruses that we deal with in this industry. And the reason why I call this out is that it's actually a virus that incorporates itself into the plant genome. And so when you breed, you basically end up with that virus moving with the plant and it becomes seed-borne. Unlike Canna yellow mosaic virus, Canna yellow streak virus and bean yellow mosaic virus are basically polyviruses, a different class of viruses. And those basically are RNA viruses, which means that they're not carried in the seed. And they basically are vectored from plant to plant, either by hands moving it, the sap, or worse, insects. A lot of times aphids would be a good virus vector. So you got a lot of aphids around, you can pick it up from other plants and carry it into Canna. The third group of viruses are curcuma viruses. It's cucumber mosaic virus and tomato aspery virus. These 2 are commonly found, and they're basically also RNA viruses that are transmitted by insects. So we got these 3 groups of viruses. It's all about viruses, Bill. So that's what we're looking for.
Gotcha. So the DNA viruses are the ones that can end up being seed-borne, whereas the RNA viruses are vectored by whether it's insects or greenhouse workers or you as walking through the crops, correct?
Yes, exactly. You got the plan. And that's why we need to have tested seed that has been bred specifically to have reduced amount of this DNA virus. Today, we've got it pretty clean. It's not 100%, but we do have it so it's a manageable disease and allows us to have these cannas in our production program.
Which is probably why we're seeing more of them out in the market now than say 5-10 years ago.
Exactly.
Okay. So now that growers kind of know what to look for, why don't you talk a little bit about the strategies and programs to minimize and manage the risk? So what do growers need to do to produce high quality canna crops, whether that's for containers or to go into the landscape?
Right. And so, basically, what we want to basically make sure that we're doing is number one, we're not using any rhizomes or corms anymore. That's a very important part of controlling it. So you only want to use seed raised canna in your production program. And make sure that you have the varieties like Canova is a good series that is been bred specifically to have very, very low levels of Canna yellow mosaic virus, and so that you can be assured that you're going to end up with the majority of your plants free of it. If you do see a plant, 1 or 2, it's not uncommon to see 1 or 2 that might have that, that you throw them out if that's appropriate practice for your particular location. One of the most important things to consider is that stress will cause promotion of that streaking that we saw that some people like and some people don't. So, the common recommendation is reduce the amount of stress. Too hot, too cold. Remember, these are warm-blooded. Too dry, because these are swamp plants. We don't get into too wet, which is kind of unusual for me, right, Bill, to not talk about being too wet. But remember, canna are really those plants that they do tolerate moist conditions. So if you get too dry, you can start expressing it. Too high of feed levels can. So, getting not, outside of the norm will basically cause this streaking to show up if the viruses are present. So you really want to manage the stress. And if you manage the stress conditions, these are just lovely plants that grow vigorously, and they provide an interesting component in mixed containers for growers. Now, Just one other comment that I might want to add that's not necessarily managing the risk, but how do you be successful with seed? Because a lot of people do have that problem. Remember, this seed is a swamp plant. So obviously, it's evolved to prevent rapid water uptake. So the seed coat on this is basically water repellent. It's like a giant raincoat on this seed. So to get the seed to germinate, what they've done is they've gone and used a laser. These are high-tech seeds, and they've drilled two little laser holes so that the water can get into the seed. But of course, you got two holes in them. So what do? You cover the seed. So when you buy Canova seed, what you get is you get a blue seed, right? And so what happens is that the coating is on there to plug up those holes. Now, being a swamp plant, you want it to be wet. And this is why it is absolutely imperative that you go and take that seed and you bury it. This is the only seed that I know of that we recommend, Bill, to actually bury. If you can see these blue seed floating on the top of this the soil, you got problems. They're not going to germinate. You need to push them down and soak them in. And you soak them in really well. So you bring them, basically manage them in a level 4 or 5 for the first probably 5-6 days. And then that way you'll get improved, more uniform germination. That's really the hardest part of this crop, is when people don't get them wet enough and they don't bury them, and then they float up like rocks in the soil. So those are kind of the things you do to manage the risk and manage this crop.
Excellent. Quick question. So when I look at the picture on the left versus the picture on the right, how quickly does that express itself on the foliage? Is that something that happens quickly, or does it happen over a period of time?
It's a
Um,
it's usually a very slow progression. So if you stress the plants, you might see a little bit. The more stress you give it, the more it is, and eventually gets to the point where it becomes very distracting, because only 1 or 2 leaves on the plant will actually show those symptoms. And so if you take a look at the PowerPoint presentation or the other documents, supporting documents that we have available, you'll be able to see a lot of pictures of what you should be looking for when you have these various viruses.
Excellent. So real quick, before we wrap up this installment of at-risk crops in our discussion of cannas, let me just call out a few additional resources to check out. We do have a very good list of videos on at-risk crops already on the Ball Seed YouTube channel. You can actually find a playlist for at-risk crops. And then to accompany that, we do have guides or white papers available at ballseed.com/quickculture/production guides, like you see on the screen, and I will definitely include that in the show notes as well. And also is the Tech on Demand podcast, brought to you by Grower Talks. So in addition to episodes like this one, you're going to find many other podcasts covering a range of greenhouse specific topics, with more being added all the time. You can subscribe to Tech on Demand podcast on your favorite podcast app, Apple Podcasts, Google, Spotify, just about all of them at this point, or go to growertalks.com/tech on demand. So Will, thanks for your time and all the team's hard work on collecting this information. And we'll be back to talk about more at-risk crops.
Excellent.
So I'm Bill Calkins with Tech on Demand, wishing you a fantastic production season. Take care out there.